We will have a discussion for 2 hours, and I will be very punctually because after this discussion, a very important event happens in Europe, the trying of the German national football soccer team to qualify for the round of 8 against Hungary. And so 2 hours for the question of freedom to deviate in the algorithmic society. This is the closing session, I think, of this lecture series. I don't think we have to make closing arguments, but some weight is on, say, the last session of this program. I will very briefly introduce the participants of this podium, this panel. This is Lucia Zedner, she's professor of criminal justice at Oxford, at All Souls College. Anna Harcourt, professor of law and of political science as I got it from in Columbia Law School and in Paris. And Pasquale, professor of law south from Columbia Law School and Brooklyn Law School. And the German participants from Frankfurt, Christoph Burchard, professor for criminal law at the Goethe-Universität, and Indra Spiecker, professor of public law, if this is the right translation of öffentliches Recht. So, my first question to the participants is, do we live in an algorithmic society? I mean, you can say you're an idiot. Didn't you know? Don't you know that Google exists, or all these observational technologies exist, and all these insurance companies trying to make something out of big data and so on? But does this add up to the concept of an algorithmic society? Because we also have all the efficiencies of this. Things don't work. Amazon proposes you, if you bought volume 1, they say, oh, perhaps you will also like to have volume 2. So one also have some skeptical attitudes towards the concept of algorithmic society. So I just try to listen to the experts. We have an algorithmic society, and what are good examples for living in such a society? Whoever feels to be addressed.
Lucia, do you want to start?
Yeah.
So I'm happy to start. I'll admit that Christoph asked us to speak for maybe 5 minutes each at the beginning, and I don't know whether you would like us to do that, or go into the more general discussion. It might be helpful just to set out a few thoughts, if that's acceptable.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Is that good with Frank and Bernard? Yep. Okay. Frank's nodding at least, and I just covered Bernard's face, which is one of the hazards of Zoom, but I think he's nodding too. So I'll just say a few words, because we were told we had 5 minutes, and so I have 5 minutes of something. And I just would like to say thank you to everybody for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. It's really an honor, and I do look forward to our exchange. The things that I would like to put on the table for us to discuss are and I entitled, because we were asked to make a few introductory remarks, I entitled mine "Trust in the Machine" with a big question mark afterwards. My questions are to consider why we've come to trust algorithms, whether we should trust them, what challenges that those algorithms pose, and how we might meet those challenges. And finally, are there reasons to hope that there might be a greater freedom to deviate, as the title of the series is suggested, or tonight's panel, and are there some signs of hope in what we might call this pandemic plague year? And I'm going to do all of that in 5 minutes, so I will speak really quickly. Just on the question of where and why we've come to rely upon algorithms, and I think that as we've already heard, they've been driven in part by a drive for efficiency, economy, effectiveness. But I think we shouldn't overlook the central role played by commercial incentives and the development of algorithmic tools as proprietary products for profit. But underlying and behind all of that, I think, is a bigger political demand for the protection of the vulnerable, the identification of sections of the population, perhaps even the general public as vulnerable, and the prioritizing of public safety over toleration of difference. And perhaps not to be missed is the decline, relative decline, perhaps until recently, of faith in professionals, in expertise, that has driven also the trust in the machine. But are algorithmic tools really effective tools, or are they automated agents of distrust? And I would just set out a few of the risks in the realm of actuarial risk assessment. Algorithms appear scientific, they appear neutral, but they bake in bias, they reproduce prejudice, they generate the usual suspects, as it were, not least in my sphere by relying upon criminal record, and therefore they replicate existing prejudices. They're also, as I've indicated, proprietary products, and their architecture is therefore concealed by intellectual property law, by commercial secrecy and the demands thereof. And that lack of transparency, I think, undermines the capacity of the defense and defense lawyering. It undermines trust in procedural justice and the rule of law. And because algorithms are closed and unknowable, I think it can be said that they generate a more generalized sense of insecurity. We don't know how Amazon puts products in front of us. And we don't know, as defendants in a criminal trial, we don't know how the algorithm has decided that we are a risky figure. It can be said too that algorithms pose challenges to core principles of justice. By fixing the future, they erode the presumption of innocence, they erode and one might even say undermine the right to a fair trial and the right to be presumed harmless. And by fixing the future, they deny our individual autonomy, our freedom of choice, and dash the right to hope, which the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has held to be fundamental to humanity and to human dignity. So can we restore the transparency by opening the black box of the algorithm? And my distinguished co-panelists have much more expertise in this regard. So I'm going to rely rather cheekily on some recommendations made recently by the United Kingdom Law Commission, who recommend the creation of a national risk register, or rather a register of algorithmic systems. They recommend the enactment of statutory transparency rights and greater powers to the UK Information Commissioner, who's an independent actor who has oversight of the regulation and access to information. Aside from recommending greater openness by greater statutory transparency, they've also said we should have the rights of greater and more systematic scrutiny. So at the moment, we rely pretty much on the kind of serendipity of individuals making private so-called freedom of information requests under data protection legislation. But that could well be replaced by public interest access, which would be done on a much more systematic basis and allow greater independent ethical evaluation of AI and information systems. And I'll just finish with a kind of slightly tentative consideration of whether we might see some small green shoots of hope in this plague year. Because I do think and Bernard and I may disagree about this, I've had sight of his thoughts. I do think that the existential threat by COVID has led us to rethink who is truly vulnerable. It's given us an opportunity to nurture public resilience, to promote social solidarity, and I think, and maybe one could overplay this, to foster greater compassion and tolerance of difference. And has radically changed our perceptions of scientific expertise and respect for that expertise. So maybe that has an impact on our trust in the machine. And I could go on. I think there are greater signs of tolerance, greater concern with the racialized injustices and the technologies of injustice that are operating, particularly within our criminal justice system. And not least also quite a strong move towards thinking about algorithms not as a means of identifying those who are risky or who are dangerous, but actually rather as a means by which to justify bail decisions, to enable greater parsimony within the criminal justice system and to allow early release of prisoners. So I'd like to end on an optimistic note, but perhaps not. I don't want to close down discussion, so I'll leave you with a more cautious question. Is it too soon to hope that these welcome signs of resilience and of humanity can prevail over our enduring trust in the machine? Thank you.
Yeah, I think Mr. Harcourt has the floor.
Thank you, Jürgen, and thank you, everyone, and thank you, Lucia, for opening with those really provocative thoughts. And of course, they respond to your question, Jürgen, whether we live in an algorithmic society. I mean, several of us have proposed other dimensions, I think, of that algorithmic society. I mean, when we talk about an algorithmic society, I think we're using that as a synonym or as a shared meaning with things like the digital age, digitization, big data, etc. Of course, Frank Pasquale has focused on the non-transparency elements of those algorithms and talked about the black box society in an extraordinary book. I focused, on the other hand, in a lot of my work on what I call the expository society, which is another dimension of the algorithmic society. And it focuses on the way our own desires feed the algorithms, the way in which we place ourselves into the hands of all these algorithms because of our desire to tweet and Facebook and Instagram and check email and buy things online and look up Google and all of those kind of extremely passionate things that we do and desirous things that we do on the internet in this new universe. Has completely exposed us, but also we voluntarily expose ourselves. So relations of power have changed in this algorithmic society, I would say. And whereas before we had been maybe placed in the panopticon forcibly, now we place ourselves there out of desire, right? We're not caged, well, many of us are not, many of us in the United States are, 2.3 million are, but we're not kind of caught in this mesh through forms of coercion so much as we're caught in this algorithmic society because we want to be on Instagram and present ourselves, right? Now, I would say that the pandemic has thrown a wrench into all of this. And I agree with Lucia that, I mean, we need to think about the way in which the pandemic and the experiences of the last 18 months have changed this universe, and in the context of the expository society, changed our desires. I would say that, you know, just a few months ago, in January 2020, we or many of us rued the expository society. We agonized over it, over this idea of being on social media, of exposing ourselves, and of losing this freedom to deviate, precisely as you suggested, Jürgen, this idea that, you know, that Amazon will tell us what book we want to read. I think that was something that we feared, but really from one moment to the next, from overnight with the COVID-19, that virtual world and all those fears became literally our salvation, our refuge, and the only escape from certain death. And so many of us privileged ones who could do this, who could turn into the digital universe, did precisely that. We downloaded Zoom, and overnight, here we are in our homes that are our offices, that are, for some people, their trading floors, that are our classrooms. We sought refuge, the fortunate ones, in a virtual bubble to protect ourselves from COVID. And overnight, the digital divide, which had always been brutally racist, but the digital divide really began to demarcate the living from the dead. Those who needed to touch people became untouchable in a way. And of course, given the rife systemic racism that traverses society, those untouchables were predominantly persons of colors who had to man the cash register, who had to, drive the subway or the buses or work in proximity to others. And all of a sudden, it was flipped now. The privileged were exposing themselves fully to the digital in order to protect themselves from the virus, while those who couldn't be in the digital space were exposing themselves to the virus, right? And I would say, though, that that there have been three chilling lessons that I've seen come out of this, and I'll go over them very quickly. And that it raises a lot of questions as to where this algorithmic society is headed. The first lesson, I think, was the impotence of these algorithms. We had all heard about the amazing potential of Google searches to predict where there would be epidemics or flus or breakouts of, all of these. We had heard so much about the extraordinary potential to perfectly track infections and share information about risk and exposure and to contact trace and all of that. That was in some sense the miracle about digital capabilities. And yet, of course, it was all for naught. At the moment when it could have saved the most lives, it was all for naught. We didn't want to download the contact apps, right? They didn't, in the United States, we didn't use contact apps, which could have saved us from such risk and from death for so many. And yet we didn't want to do it because we really had lost faith in this, in the way in which our data was captured. And we knew that practically, for the marginal way in which the app would work, they would be sucking all of our data. It was, I think, a digital tragedy. Imagine what could have been done in a country like the United States or in many European countries with really strong algorithmic contact tracing. That was the raison d'etre of all of these algorithms, and yet they failed us. The second lesson, I think, was the shallowness of the digital and of all these algorithms. I mean, somehow the romance of the digital age has passed. This idea that we would be living in this virtual reality that would be so much more rich than our analog lives, our physical lives, that we could wear virtual casques and experiment and feel everything. And you know what? It turns out, well, there's screen fatigue, there's Zoom exhaustion, there's depression, and there's isolation. That's what this world of the virtual existence that we've lived in has shown us, right? In a way, this pandemic has crushed the optimism of living in a virtual world. We realize that the loss of those everyday human contacts of just sitting at a bar and watching others, or sharing a table with friends, or even just avoiding strangers on the street, how enjoyable that is, right? The emptiness, the solitude, the shallowness of the digital experience. I think that's what we've seen. And then third, the noise, right? I mean, I think as the pandemic hit us, we all entered this digital world. We all started checking Twitter all the time and Instagram and the news all the time. We were checking our screens and our devices at every moment in isolation. And of course, at the time, our dear former president, Donald Trump, was Twitter in chief, right? And all of a sudden, Donald Trump got kicked off of Twitter, right? And we realized, oh Lord, how quickly we realized what a better world it is not to have Trump on social media, right? I mean, our lives have improved so much in this country by the fact that we don't have to listen to Trump on social media or watch him on any of these devices, and all of a sudden, I think we're realizing how much just noise and wasted energy is involved in all of this. And we began to see what a muddled morass the digital age had become. I experience those, I hear it from others. I hear it in interviews and in conversations with others. What, of course, will come of this pandemic experience? Well, it's hard to know. Will we return to the way we were? Or is there a new future beyond the Algorithmic Society? I think only time will tell. Of course, I have more questions than answers, but I'm hoping that our conversation will provide some inroads into some of those questions. Thank you, Jürgen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pasquale, it's your turn.
Thank you. And I really, so much food for thought there. And I'll try to set up some of my own concerns relatively quickly so we can converse about the many topics on offer here. I want to actually start, though, with an answer about the Algorithmic Society and an attempt at definition of what an Algorithmic Society would be, quoting from a work by Jack Balkin. Jack Balkin is a mentor of mine, teaches con law and digital law at Yale. And he defined an algorithmic society as, quote, a society organized around social and economic decision-making by algorithms, robots, and AI agents, who not only make the decisions, but also, in some cases, carry them out. And I think that this is a really interesting question to think about is, to what extent do different sectors within our society follow this type of paradigm, where we have an organization of the sector around social and economic decision-making by algorithms? I believe that this has been taken furthest in realms of finance and technology. I think particularly if we think about, say, how people get their news, and there's a really interesting piece just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Carl Bangstrom and co-authors about just the epical change in how information flows given social media, and how, you know, this is just such and we really haven't taken stock of its influence. And I think also in finance, there's such enthusiasm for things like algorithmic trading, for benchmarking and modes of evaluating investments that are deeply algorithmically driven. And I think to the extent that the finance and technology firms occupy the commanding heights of the economy and society, they tend to push downwards these modes of evaluation onto the entities that rely on them to either be funded or found, right? Finance provides the funding, search and technology often provides the finding, how you find something. And so the entities that control the funding and finding are themselves algorithmically driven, and then transpose or impose those modes of evaluation onto other sectors. And how deep is this imposition? I mean, one thing that I just have to recall from my personal experience is I have done a series of articles critiquing algorithmic application of law. And a very well-meaning colleague said to me at one presentation, well, if you're against algorithmatizing law or making law more algorithmic, aren't you against thought itself? Right, and I thought to myself, well, this is quite desperate, right? That somehow that the whole mode of thought, that the idea that to think at all must be done on the mode of computation, or must be eventually subsumed under forms of either quantification or algorithmic step-by-step reasoning, was to me really troubling. And I want to now move, though, from what are the practical consequences for individuals of this? Well, I think I'll give a few examples, and then how reformists have responded, and then how I want to open up some more spaces for response here. And the examples of algorithmatization are, say, in schools now, at least in the US, there are aggression detectors that record and analyze students' voices, sometimes without consent, that will report to administration about, say, a potentially violent student or violent interaction. Okay, no person is intermediating there before the report. It's just the algorithms are looking at that. There's something called Shot Spotter that will spot shots and then report those to police. There are human resources departments of employers that either are using or want to use artificial intelligence to parse applicants' expressions and gestures for nervousness, mood, and troubling behavior patterns. Right, so you could upload this talk that I'm giving, and in fact, that's sometimes why I'm somewhat reluctant to go on YouTube sometimes, because I feel like all of my presentations are just this dossier that could be used against me eventually by some AI algorithm that finds that my pattern of blinks or twitches is suspect. We also have corporations investing in affective computing. This is affective with an A, not an E, to decode customers. And we have consultants offering insurers facial analysis to estimate the real age of applicants. I saw one company advertise its product and said, just as if you go to a high school reunion, you realize that people age differently, right? Some age gracefully, some less so, that the life insurance algorithm would look at people's faces and say, this is someone who likely is more likely to die than others. And so all of these things, I think, are, they are troubling on one level in terms of the power imposed, but they also operate in what the philosopher of social science, Jason Blakely, has called on a double hermeneutic effect, which is that it is not merely that we're being interpreted by machines, but then that we interpret ourselves in order to match with or to otherwise optimize ourselves according to the principles and priorities of the machines we're facing. Okay, so in response to that, there are what I would call two waves of algorithmic accountability. Okay, and so the first wave would say, it has been occupied by and very skillfully prosecuted by those who want to stop discrimination. For example, we probably have all seen the footage online of the algorithmic, say someone that puts their hand under a machine to get soap, and it recognizes a white hand, but not a hand of a Black person or someone with darker skin tone. Okay, that to me is clearly a revolting aspect of algorithmic decision-making here as to who gets soap or not, right, by this one small machine in a bathroom. But it has very important implications well beyond that, you know, in terms of like facial recognition technology. And we've seen some pushes there to make sure that this technology is less discriminatory, to, for example, include more sources of data. And I think that this is a very important movement. We're going to see this in medicine as well. For example, there's already work in dermatology, insisting that medical databases include all skin types as opposed to, say, just dominant groups in the society. And we're going to see more minoritized groups invited to participate in developing more fair and transparent algorithmic assessments. But the question I have, though, is that to come to our theme of deviation, and whether we have freedom to deviate or not, are there some areas where we don't want to make the algorithmic processing of human beings, of our behavior, our faces, our activities, we don't want to say make those more and more accurate or reform them. Sometimes we may want to end them. Right, and I think we saw that recently with the European Data Protection Supervisor's response to the European Union's proposed artificial intelligence regulation, where the EDPS said, you know, directly in response to the Commission, that you probably are not going far enough in banning facial recognition in many scenarios, just because of the threats to human freedom that it imposes. And also, let's look at emotion recognition. Right, that emotion recognition could have exactly these types of effects of not permitting, of regimentation, standardization, modulation, that are in their own ways threats to human freedom. And so therefore, I think my final reflection here would be that the power and prestige of science arises out of the ability it grants us to manipulate and control the natural world. But we should be very cautious about any psychological and social science that reduces the human to be one more resource to be fully understood, controlled, and manipulated. And my prediction is that the future of algorithmic reform is going to involve moving from this first wave of algorithmic accountability of anti-discrimination, due process, and transparency to a world where we take on the very fundamental issues of freedom, of non-alienation, and of giving people a sense of meaning and power in their daily interactions with the artifacts of the algorithmic society. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, how to start the discussion? One proposal. I have the impression that there is an underlining argument that says something takes the lead in society, for instance, algorithmic constructions. And this is why it is because it is working effectively. And I have the question, is there a strict connection? Couldn't it be that it takes the lead in society without being very effective, or with having very huge side effects which are not taken into consideration if we call it effective? So couldn't it be with algorithmic construction, like with capitalism, that something takes the lead in society because it is not so effective. Just as a proposal.
I'll jump in quickly. I mean, of course, that's a brilliant question. I mean, to imagine that it takes the lead because it is efficient and functions properly, you'd have to have a kind of University of Chicago free market, efficient market theory of the universe, basically, right? I mean, that would the only way in which that could be demonstrated, if there were any way to demonstrate it, it would substantiate a kind of, you know, market efficiency theory. And I think what we have seen, I mean, in the development of actuarial methods, which were developed at the beginning of the 20th century, and in a way are the methods that would lead to yes, Christoph, that's right, and that would lead to ultimately the algorithmic society that we have today. I think it's clear that there were certain ways in which the fact that you could get results, obtain results, definite results from actuarial methods in itself becomes a motive to use them in a way. So in other words, and I think that would be true of algorithms as well, but I want to hear from Lucia and Frank, of course, also from Christoph and Indra and everyone else. But there's a way in which the fact that there's the possibility of tangible results, right or wrong, efficient or not, means that we kind of, I think we have a tendency to then embrace those methods because they have more certainty, tangibility than other potential methods. So we're not going to, so we would go towards actuarial methods rather than talking about mens rea, say, or blameworthiness, because we can't measure, we can't really measure that, we can't really prove it, but the actuarial prediction tool works, and the result is that it then shapes the way we think. It transforms the way that we see the world, the way that we think about punishment, etc. But I've already said too much. I want to hear from everyone else.
Let me jump in from a public law standpoint here. I like the question, and I'm not sure whether I really like the question, because it sounds as if the history in which we have lived, and think about mercantilism, think about industrialism, the Roman Empire, whatever, that efficiency was the reason, and a particular efficiency of one big thing that created certain agendas and certain eras and controlled them. I'm not sure whether that's true, but assuming that it was, then I think that actually, yes, it might be that we see something new, because what we see combined is the age-long dream of power through information on the one hand, and then what we see is what we've learned through, sorry again, Chicago school, that if you are able to concentrate power because you have limited access, or you grant only limited access to the resources, then you can actually rule the world. And we see that this is exactly happening with artificial intelligence, with big data, etc. It's not just that we see the information is present, but that the information technology to exploit this is also in the same hands as the information. And all of this goes along with a wonderful narrative. And the narrative is, for once in all of the history of mankind, we see there's a technology development without any side effects. And that's the story that some of the big giants in this game are telling us. And they're telling it to us very promisingly, because they're saying, we're not doing any evil, we're just showing the world as it is. The problem is that the world is not efficient, and therefore you can exploit it if you have the assets. And so, yes, it might be that this is an efficient solution, but it might also be that it's the totally inefficient solution in the long run. And the question is it a path dependency from which we can never deteriorate again, or deviate, to put it positively, or is it something which allows us to enter into spheres which are totally unknown so far? And coming from a public law standpoint, of course, the question is also who are the winners and who are the losers in legal points. And a constitutional lawyer always looks at a democratic society, and that's where all of us are coming from, as something to protect minorities and to protect the, let's say, uncertain and also the unusual. So there's room for development. And that's exactly what the Algorithmic Society is contradicting. Basically, they're trying to create an atmosphere in where we have groups of people where everybody is located in certain boxes, and being boxed is being judged. And because you're judged and because it's a self-fulfilling promise, it might in the end be totally destructive because we're killing innovation. Big, big topic.
And if I could jump in, I completely agree with this idea about the narratives. And I think this historical narrative of sort of technology without negative consequences is so important there. And I just wanted to also just build on this idea of effectiveness, or how we define effectiveness or not. And because I was recently reflecting on proposals by Elizabeth Warren to regulate large technology firms. And essentially, these proposals were trying to impose certain obligations on them, trying to ensure that they would have certain types of responsibilities, and would even break them up in some ways. And one of the leading tech commentators in the US responded by saying, you know, Senator Warren doesn't understand technology, and she particularly doesn't understand that Google has solved search. Okay, so this idea that search could be solved as a problem, something that even Google itself presented as the idea of organizing the world's information, that could be solved by a particular firm, is deeply troubling. But I think it's indicative of a sort of deregulatory mindset that would say, well, what it's doing, it's popular, and therefore it must be the solution. But we all know there are examples of being trapped in, say, a local maximum as opposed to a global maximum. There are examples in Darwinian theory of forms of fitness that are really not that adaptive for the ecology as a whole, but are adaptive for particular entities within it. And finally, you know, I think what's really promising here is the thinking about the problem of what exactly is being optimized, or what is it effective for. And I think that all of those questions I'll revisit, but I think that these are really important questions to ask about any claim of the effectiveness of the algorithmic or the digital.
If I may come in, I find this absolutely fascinating. And one of the reasons I find it fascinating is because if one transplants these discussions to the legal sphere, and one thinks about what it means to do justice, then of course effectiveness has a role, and we would be misleading if we said that efficiency and effective justice is not important. And one can see very ineffective justice systems like that in Italy, where cases can take years to come to trial, and you know, following the English aphorism, justice delayed is justice denied. Inefficiency is a form of injustice and can be really deleterious. But effectiveness, it seems to me, is privileging a certain type of and set of metrics which are calculable, which apparently are neutral, which claim to be scientific, which are standardized and uniform, and not thinking about the other kinds of forms of effectiveness, which probably we don't call effectiveness at all, but that are central to legal judgment, discretion, judgment itself, discernment, the ability to distinguish and differentiate, the exercise of humanity and compassion and mercy in certain spheres, certainly my own, and whether lawyers have been too quick to concede to the purveyors of algorithms, whether it constitutes a decline in public or indeed self-assessment of professional expertise. And I mean, one of the really interesting aspects, I think, is the degree to which scientific experts have been, in the UK at least, largely excluded from the courtroom in favour of very rapidly delivered algorithmic outcomes. And one question then arises is, why have they allowed themselves to be excluded, and why have the courts been so quick to leap on the algorithms in favour of the experts, and particularly in the role I'm thinking here of, for example, the side professions, psychiatry, psychology, and so on, who played an important part. And that's partly by nature of some of the tasks which those professionals have been called upon to do, which they regard, and quite rightly, as being tasks which are perhaps beyond them. And again, reverting to my own sphere of criminal law and criminal justice, the more you ask professionals to predict the future, the more uncomfortable they become, and the readier they are to concede their professionalism and to concede their judgment to purportedly scientific instruments which will do the job for them. And where one might have expected professional pushback or judicial pushback, actually there's been an extraordinary readiness to embrace these purportedly effective tools. Thank you.
Maybe if I may just very quickly to add to that. I think the question was really crucial and also an excellent question to start with, because it relates to, what are we talking about? Are we talking some kind of scientific, neutral, objective thing that all helps us develop and get better, or is it a deeply normative construct which is so deeply entangled with power, distribution of power questions? And I rather, but maybe I'm too Frankfurty already, am on the second side, that there is no neutral technology, but rather that technology is deeply normative, deeply entangled with questions of power. What I think is new in this respect is that we approach this AI or the Algorithmic Society, that there is not only one narrative, but that there is several, and they all seemingly support the introduction and the implementation of this technology. So there is the neoliberal account, which is seemingly correct because it generates a lot of power and money. Then there is the real liberal, freedom-oriented voices, and I believe that many proponents of further digitalizations, for example, of criminal law and criminal justice, seemingly believe that they can liberate the criminal justice system from biases and whatnot. I don't believe that they're all cynists or white supremacists who really want to entrench what is happening. So I really think that there are those liberal voices out there, but it also caters to almost theological voices who see salvation in technology. There's, of course, the authoritarian side as well. I mean, look to China, probably. Our colleague from PISA, Alberto Di Martino, rightly mentioned in the chat that there's also this perfectionist agenda there. We can make these machines ever better. And whilst, humans are, well, we are fallible. And so this is what I think what is really crucial to note in my eyes, that AI or the Algorithmic Society is deeply normative, but it's not only one single tale, but a lot of tales, and they all generate this enormous also coalitions of the willing. So the liberals cooperate with the neoliberals, with the authoritarians, and this is quite astonishing if you try to deconstruct it.
Well, I would agree that your proposal that every technology is embedded in some normative context, but it is a technology, and so I think we face the strange situation that we have to attribute effectiveness and non-effectiveness to it. I found interesting. It was interesting to me what Mr. Harcourt said, that the algorithmic world didn't play that great role in the pandemic crisis. That one would have expected that all these predictive capacities and all this this average thinking, bringing everything down to an average number, that would have helped us very much in this crisis, and that's interesting. I think, because normally one could say, okay, it's effective and it's efficient and it's Chicago and it's neoliberal and we hate it for its effectiveness. But people would say, a lot of people would say, okay, if it's effective, I take it. But then the point is interesting if it, in which sense it is not effective, or it didn't work, or it didn't play out its capacities. Also, so perhaps this could be a further point to elaborate.
Can I come in here? Because I think there are very striking jurisdictional variations in this regard. And so far as I understand it, some of those nations that have done best during the pandemic are those precisely where people jumped to sign up to the contract tracing apps, and where those apps were developed and applied at a very, very early stage. One of the problems is if you don't apply them when the numbers are tiny, they become also almost useless. But actually, I mean, just a different story that comes out of this poor benighted island that sits off the coast of Europe, where I happen to be, and would still like to think I was in Europe, but I'm not. But there we are. Which is that people were two things really. People were actually very quick to sign up to these contact tracing apps. But they had two quite unexpected effects, maybe three. One was the reason they didn't work was the contract tracing was not in place. So there were a lot of people signing up, but nothing was happening as a consequence of that. But there were also some unexpected side effects. And one of them was completely counterproductive, which that people had such faith in the apps that when they signed up to them, they thought that but merely by having the NHS app, and I, like my whole family and everybody I know has the app on their phone, thought that they were somehow protected by those apps and behaved in more risk creating ways because they thought the app was saving them. But there was also, and this comes back to Frank's comments, there was also a very interesting kind of affective aspect to this, which is that people believe that the mere fact of checking into a venue, as we all do, and we check out and all this kind of stuff with our phones as a matter of course, again is providing us with some kind of assurance, notwithstanding the fact that we know that it's doing nothing to stop people from breathing on us or whatever else. So the apps are providing a kind of curious, affective and entirely fraudulent pretense, which may actually exacerbate the system, not otherwise. So it would be, I mean, one interesting question might be, in which jurisdictions do we sign up and in which do we not? Can I just actually just use this opportunity to push, well, not push back, but just to ask Bernard a question also about the pandemic. You said in your presentation that overnight the digital world became our world, and there was this digital divide between those who were and were not living in that digital world. But it's hardly the case that Amazon stopped offering us shopping options, or that the movie streaming services stopped telling us which movies to work. I mean, one could say that we became more ruled by the algorithm by virtue of living in this digital world, couldn't we?
Yeah, no, I think that's what I was trying to say. I mean, we exposed ourselves completely. I mean, you know, I didn't have any choice. I had to do everything on Zoom from one day to the next. I had to teach my courses, meet my students, have any conversations with colleagues. Everything was on Zoom. Zoom wasn't very secure. Wasn't a very secure platform. Probably still is not. But, you know, I did not have any choice in the matter. That was it. I mean, you know, so we did expose ourselves, and it was continually. And during that process, we were continually then tracked and, of course, recommended and whatnot. So I think that's right. I mean, that's the sense in which kind of like we exposed ourselves to the digital age in order to protect ourselves from the virus, whereas others had to expose themselves to the virus. But on this question of the apps and the breakdown of the promise of algorithms is also, I mean, So in this country, so it varied country by country, of course, as to willingness to take on these apps. It also varied on the coercive nature of whether one had to. It depended on whether one was in a more, well, I don't want to say more authoritarian, because Trump was our president at the time. But in any event, differences in governmental responses. But also, I mean, the fact is that the promise of algorithms and of the digital age was that also it would be achieved regardless of our participation, right? In other words, the promise of these algorithms is that just by the fact that we are what we are reading, what searches we put into our search browser, where we are with the GPS, what Wi-Fi signals we're sending, and that all of that information. I mean, some of the hidden promise was that that is going to allow some form of governance, right? That people's searches would tell us something. And of course, Google would be able to know that. So that even if we weren't kind of on a contact tracing app, everything that we do, all the digital traces and all the exhaust that we leave would be able to tell us kind of the truth about us in a way. And it seems that just didn't happen, at least in a country like the United States. You know, I don't know how the digital exhaust was being captured in a country like China, but in the United States, that hidden promise, and I think that it's right. Everyone was talking about these different narratives, right? I mean, that narrative that these digital algorithms would tell us the truth about ourselves in a way. And that they are pure. And I go back to that. I think we had that conversation. Indra was bringing this up, right? That they are pure. The data may be dirty, but the algorithms are pure. And also, as your colleague DiMartino was suggesting, can be improved, right? That's the AI side of all of this, that it can be improved, that it will improve itself cleanly. And that if there's a problem of race discrimination, well, it's just that you've got dirty data, but the algorithm itself is pure. And I think in a way those stories are less, maybe less convincing right now. I don't know. It might just be a blip in the road, and we return to, you know, this divine faith in the digital.
May I just ask, you know, we have so many jurisdictions here. So what is now your impression? Is it like that people get to realize that this is not the salvation, or isn't the narrative now catching on? Well, we have not developed these algorithms properly. We didn't have the data, so let's get more data. Let's get more funding to get the algorithms more pure and to, you know, gather more data. Just throw it in, and the next pandemic, of course, then we are ready. So I'm not sure whether the hope, more or less, on the pandemic is really. We should really trust on that hope, because actually how these machines work, it is that constant promise of the possibility to improve by improving the algorithms, computing power, and data gathering, that we can learn. And I'm not sure whether that promise has been really properly dispelled.
If I could jump in on that, I think this is quite an interesting argument, and I just want to make it very concrete, and I think the concreteness may also expose its general problems. So about 5 years ago or so, I critiqued some will writing software. There was software that said, you know, why do you have a lawyer to write your will? You could have this write how you'd like to dispose of your assets at your death. And I noted, well, there's a problem with this software. It doesn't have a option for same-sex partners, and it doesn't discuss directly people's pension savings that are specially applied in this law in the US called 401k that has special rules of disposition. So then the response, when I would present this to others would be, well, thank you so much for making those critiques. Version 2.0 will add in what you said, and it'll be a lot better. Of course, there's no payment for that critique. It's just, the idea is that you're supposed to the crowd will work for free to make the thing better. And we'll all work for free to eventually enrich the people that own the algorithm that, have control of the ability to charge fees for it. And so what I found so troubling about this, though, is that, okay, that may work with respect to those particular angles, but there are so many other elements here that are also, say, issues that are values questions, right? Do you ask questions about what charities will you give to or not? You will have other sorts of questions that are not really technical questions, but that really involve overarching ability of communities to have input. And I think that in my book, New Laws of Robotics, what I saw the pattern over and over again is that when those who are advancing algorithmic solutions to health, education, law enforcement, the military, other areas, they would advance these solutions and just partake of that narrative of progress, of automatic progress that you mentioned, Christoph. The problem would become, well, what data will inform it, right? How will we choose that data? Who chooses which data is relevant and which is not? I was recently looking at a proposal for natural language processing in disability determinations in the US. And in this proposal, they were attempting to base some efforts to computer software for literally millions of claims on a sample of 400 claims. Okay. And my question is, well, where did that sample come from? What's not represented in that sample? And I think that these very basic foundational questions of how representative is the data going into the AI, how often is it updated, who are we relying on to update it, are they being fairly compensated, are they professionals or are they just people who are looking for a job that may or may not care about it, like for example, say an MTurk worker who maybe just wants to get the human intelligence task done and make the money off of those tasks. All of those are such critical questions, and I think all of them undermine a narrative of automatic improvement via algorithmic fine-tuning.
Yeah, just add to Bernard was talking about the promises and the expectations. And if I take most of the contributions in this discussion into account, one could perhaps say that, isn't that true for every technology which is proposed, that it is always accompanied by narratives, norms, hopes, expectations, promises. This was even true for the computer when it was introduced, and also for some sciences combined with technologies. I remember, because I participated myself in it, neuroscience. It was introduced as the tool to solve many problems. If we have neuroscience with new machines, we could do more justice to perpetrators in the criminal justice system. We could prevent crime. We could solve many, many problems when we have really perfect neuroscience, look into the brain, intervene before something bad happens, even optimize the brain, make it more perfect, make it better to solve difficult problems, and so on. And there were the same promises, the same expectations. In the science system, it was the same run and rush to get grants for new research on the brain. You could combine brain science, neuroscience with criminal law, with philosophy, with sociology, and so on and so on. You got the grant when there was brain science and neuroscience was in. So the same hopes, the same promises, and so on. And perhaps this is part of this movement of the presentation and development of new technologies. And what I found interesting is perhaps not so much the question whether the technologies fulfill the promises. I think that never happens. And perhaps what Bernard Harcourt presented us is another example that the pandemic now demonstrated that algorithms are not so perfect as all the promises said that it was. But what I think is more interesting to find out what are the promises and what do the promises reveal about our expectations, what we want to have. And if making people more perfect in their behavior to adapt to new technologies, I mean, this is a kind of promise where we should ask what are we expecting? What are our hopes behind which accompany such a technology? And I think that's more interesting, and there should be more research done than just looking on the technology. And to take one example from the criminal justice system, what is the promise to make obedience to the law more perfect? What's the, and to come back to the question of this evening, what is the hope that people would not deviate anymore from law? What a kind of hope is that? Independent of the question whether algorithms could realize that hope or not. I think that's less interesting. That might be dangerous or risky, but what does this hope reveal about our attitudes and expectations?
If I can jump in. Oh, sorry, Lucia, you want to go in?
No.
Okay.
No,
I'll jump in quickly.
Bernard, you go first.
Two things. Just building on Klaus and Jürgen's points about kind of what is the rationality of algorithmic society? What are those objectives and ambitions, and how does the logic work itself? The other question that I would add on that would be, and this would be a question for the critical philosophers, maybe Reiner and others, is how many, one thing about this, the way in which the algorithmic logic works is precisely, Jürgen, as you were suggesting, that it's always like, well, wait a minute, oh, we just needed to do it more, right? In other words, the reason it backfired, the reason it doesn't work wasn't because it doesn't work, but it's because we didn't do it enough. Now, that is, in a sense, that is a form of a rhetorical form that is common to many forms of reasoning. I'm thinking, for instance, of an area I spend a lot of time with is what I call the counter-revolution, or la guerre moderne, or counterinsurgency warfare. The French in Algeria, say, the response of the French in Algeria, of the commanders in Algeria, was not that counterinsurgency strategy didn't work, is that we didn't do it enough, right? In other words, we needed to torture more people, we needed to get more information, and we were hampered by ethics and by progressives and by politics. We were hampered. We just didn't do it enough. And in a way, I hear that logic also in this algorithmic context. It's like, well, and as you were suggesting, Frank, it's like, okay, thanks, great. You told us where the weakness was. Well, we can fix that. And, we just need to do it more. And one question is, is that common to all forms of rationality? This kind of, well, the reason it didn't work was that we didn't do it enough, and what we need to do is more? Or is it something peculiar about algorithmic society, particularly, was what I wanted to kind of put on the table. And the quick second thought I wanted to say in response to these issues about predictive policing, Ricky Dean raised in the chat, and Frank addressed some of these points about predictive policing. And something also, I think, Klaus, you were talking about the way in which, could we get people to make sure that no one commits a crime, right? The fundamental problem with all of this algorithmic logic is that it is not predicting crime. And that's the problem with this predpol and predictive policing. It doesn't predict crime or criminality or who is committing crime. It predicts who the police are going to stop and arrest and prosecute. In other words, you're predicting the police behavior, not the criminal behavior. And that's what, and that is what is kind of just fundamentally wrong with predpol and predictive policing algorithms, which has something to do, Klaus, with the question of, you know, what is it exactly that you're trying to achieve with this algorithmic ambition? And in a way, I want to suggest that in many instances, it simply misfires because you're not getting data and you're not predicting what you are intending to try to restrain. Sorry.
But Bernard, does it really misfire, or isn't it perpetuating that which you, from a cynical point of view, that which
Yes.
you want to perpetuate? So
Yes. Right. I mean, it misfires if one genuinely were. I mean, right. What is actually trying to be achieved is another matter. But if one were genuinely trying to say predict crime or criminality, it's going to misfire because that's not what you're getting at. You know. Sorry.
May I come back in response to Bernard? Thank you. So one of my concerns is that algorithms are not going to go away. So somehow we have to, as lawyers, we have to work out how we tame them. And I mean, one rather obvious thing to say, and we have some Frank and Bernard already in the room, as it were, people who have become technologically much more literate and who have the capacity to understand that this is not only, Bernard's not so sure, you're too modest, but have the capacity not only to critique, but actually to begin to understand how these algorithms work. And I suspect this is not just a matter about data inputs, but also value inputs. And maybe we could talk more about values, because one of the things that really concerns me is, okay, so we could try and clean up the data, though even that's going to be very difficult because algorithms basically deal with things which are quantifiable, and justice doesn't. It deals with values. So how are we going to get those into the machine, as it were? But I'm wondering how we can get algorithms to represent and reflect and uphold things that we all hold dear, like due process, like procedural protections, Rechtsgut in Germany, basic due process in UK and US, and so on. And how do we know when those should kick in? And one of the things that really concerns me, and I don't know the answer to this, I'd be really interested to hear, actually, particularly from Frank, which is that to the extent that these, well, also Bernard, to the extent that these algorithms identify suspect populations, they act as kind of dragnets, and they drag people in and they identify people as persons of interest or presumptively suspect or risky people or whatever. How do we translate those persons of interest into people who are formally legally suspects and who become the bearers of procedural rights? And when do those procedural rights kick in? And how do we ensure that those rights are kicking in at a stage before the legal system perhaps has formally identified them? Because the path between being identified as a person of interest and being pulled into the system is potentially rather rapid. And so if we're to live without, I mean, it's a bit like learning to live with COVID. Learning to live with the algorithm actually, I think, requires us and makes it incumbent upon us to think about how we subject the algorithm to the precepts and the values and the principles of justice. And I just would quite like to hear more about how people think we might do that, because I don't think it's just about data, and I don't think it's about trying to, stop using the algorithms. I think that's unrealistic.
I like the thought of talking about how to integrate normative standards into algorithms, because technology tries to behave as if there was no normative impact in algorithmic decision making, which we know is not true. And it's going beyond just the question of discrimination or bias and debiasing or something like this. It goes way beyond this. The problem I have, and this is why I'm a little bit stunned by your question, because it's such an easy question, but so difficult to answer. And I was wondering why nobody has ever posed them before in that easy manner, straightforward. What can we do? What you described, due process, etc. are tools which are usually used, procedural tools, if you have substantive material uncertainty. So we don't really know what we want. We don't know if someone is actually, the suspect is actually criminal or not. So before we know that, and prior to being able to judge that, we give people procedural rights. We do the same thing in public law, basically. We don't really know what's the right decision, whether or not to build this or to have this zoning law or not. So what we do is we have tons of procedure based on the EU, so that the environmental activists get their hearsay and the others do, and the kindergarten next door, etc., etc. And I don't really know how we can achieve that with algorithms or algorithmic systems, to speak of that. I mean, we're not talking about just one little bitty bit where there is an A to B causality connection, but we're talking about systems where we have add-on services and add-ons on all levels, where we have data from different sources, etc., etc. And I think what the someone, I think it was Bernard, mentioned it, or Frank, the AI regulation which the EU proposed is pretty much sticking up to exactly that type of procedure, and it's not going to work because it will not cover the essence of what algorithmic decision making is really all about. That you are at a very, very early stage trying to where you would have to modify at an extremely early stage when you don't really know where a self-learning system is actually leading to, integrate certain procedural standards. And I do a lot of research and a lot of work with computer scientists, and that's something where they have never really been able to give me good answers how to integrate normative standards into their technology.
I think that question about integrating normative standards into technology is a really important one. And I think that it comes up in many areas. And I think as we look at some of the empirical work, for example, on self-regulation and privacy and other forms of compliance at firms, it's so important to look into that, because unfortunately, just to build on your concerns about the regulation, Indra, there is, even in high-risk AI applications as identified in the proposed regulation, there is a potential reliance for self-regulation by firms, for firms to sort of be doing some of the work and reporting themselves and trying to bring themselves within compliance, et cetera. And the concerns I have is there are now two narratives about this type of self-regulation. One is a narrative saying that firms are investing more and more in privacy and presumably in other areas of algorithmic responsibility, and that this investment is something that is leading us to a more fair and just future via co-regulation or new forms of regulation that include firms in terms of governing themselves. But others say, and here I would point to the sociological work of Ari Ezra Waldman, who interviewed a lot of the coders at leading technology firms. He found that as soon as there was a conflict between profit incentive and any of the requests by the compliance personnel or privacy protectors and the higher levels of the company, that profits took first place and would overrule the efforts to impose normative obligations within the technology itself. So I think that we cannot only talk about, say, privacy by design, fairness by design, anti-discrimination by design, which I think are buzzwords now of much of the AI ethics community, but instead we have to move on and say, what are the actual forms of accountability and the forms of punishment that would occur, to the firm and potentially to individuals within the firm if there are failures to meet the standards that are set by the duly constituted authorities.
I have a question concerning the conflict between algorithmic enthusiasts and us. The question is relating to the description of the pandemic situation, that we can say, okay, Google didn't work that well in fighting the pandemic, but the social sciences also didn't. So what is our proposal to fight against the algorithmic illusion. I mean, the social sciences in the pandemic year, it was a complete disaster. We had it was delegated to the physicists and the model makers, and fine with me. They did a good job, but social science was completely out of discussion. We had no real understanding of the situation of the pandemic, the transport of the virus, and where did it happen, why, and which. We had very abstract descriptions that people of color, as Burchard has said, suffered more than white people. But this is a description which holds true for every crisis in society. That is not specific for pandemics. So my question would be: is the strength of the algorithmic department in our society, does it depend on the weakness of the social understanding of our society, the other side?
I'm happy to jump in. Can you hear me? I have to change because New York City, there's a lot of noise. Otherwise, you guys are going to get bombarded with ambulances. But all right. That's a fascinating question. I wonder what other disciplines did disappoint us. And the way you were talking, I was thinking more of epidemiology, maybe, than social science. Although the minute I start to think about that, I then feel that there are really two axes that were the most important, more important than the algorithms, and more failures than the Algorithmic Society. And those two axes were the traditional ones of economics and politics, in a way, right? I mean, because when I think of the real failures, I think of authoritarian politicians who denied the risk and pushed their countries into mass death, right? The United States, 600,000 people. How many of those hundreds of thousands of people who died of COVID could have avoided death if there had been, a president who told people to wear masks, or who led by example, following the epidemiology and the science, right? And we can think of Bolsonaro, and we can think of Modi, and obviously there's that dimension, which and the second one is the economic dimension. And here I see failure with the vaccine rollout, and particularly with the economic models that resulted in, I think, scarcity in opulent countries, even in Europe, for instance, and definite inequalities throughout the world, and the global problems of economics. So, I mean, if I had to, my first instinct would be, it seems to me that the greatest failures were along politics and political economy, and that it wasn't so much a failure of algorithms, but this idea that, algorithms, in the way, I like the way you phrase this, which are the people who are skeptical of algorithms versus those who are in favor of algorithms. I think that's how you pose the question, right, for the other people who like algorithms or something like that. I think the point is that the algorithms are mere instruments, mere technology, mere techniques to achieve certain kinds of knowledge. And it's when the algorithmic society, in some sense, is perhaps this is an illusion, but when it is taken over by this illusion that it can govern in some way, and that we are not governing, but it is governing as a result, truth is governing through the algorithm, right? And not humans, that you have the problem. For me, the problem is not algorithms and not the technology itself, because if it's mastered in a way now, okay, so we'll go back, Reiner will have to intervene on mastering nature and technology, but if it's just a tool, which is what it might be, just a tool for prediction, then it could very well fit within a proper form of political and economic governance, right? In which case we don't have to be like opposed to algorithms any more than we're opposed to thermometers, right? It's just a tool. But once we imagine that it becomes this algorithmic society which has this neoliberal cast to it, because obviously Google, I mean the GAFAs are profiting the most from this idea that it's providing truth. That's the problem. Maybe that, I hope that made some sense, but that would be my first kind of intuitive response, I think.
Don't you think that every tool goes with a fantasy?
Yeah, that's a great line. Yes. Yeah, but I think here that the tool itself doesn't have the fantasy. The tool is fantasized. And so we fall in the fantasy that someone is constructing. These fantasies aren't of their own. And it's not the tool itself that made the fantasy. I think it's, yeah, Reiner.
Well, can I come in on this, Bernard? Even though I'm not sure I'm an expert on the question you raised earlier about whether there's a drive toward ever more technology once you have started. I would presume it's not an automatic drive to ever increase or intensify the technology, but there's definitely the temptation that before you stop a technology, think of nuclear technology, you try to perfect it. And so I guess, I'm not sure it is a law of rationality, but it is surely a temptation, right? Such as in climate change, people say, lots of people say we have to stop CO2 emission, but others say we have to engage in climate engineering, and we will find ways to deflect the sunshine. So there's always this option. But can I come back to the last round of discussion you just had about the tool, because that is something that I had on my mind while listening to your great conversation. If we call this thing the Algorithmic Society, what exactly is it that we have in mind? Is it, why would we call a new period with that name? Is the Algorithmic Society, in other words, just increasing the rifts, power struggles, and structures of the pre-algorithmic society? Or does it qualitatively produce new forms of power, new power classes, such as when, Bernard, you talked about the digital divide, it sounded as if the digital divide pretty much reproduces other social divides, which we knew, class divides, racial divides, which we knew from before the algorithmic society. So is this a qualitatively new form of society in which not just the old forms of power, of freedom, of trust and mistrust are intensified? That could be one option. That would be possible, right? Or is it bringing forth a new form of society, at least in certain aspects, for which we would need then, this goes back to Jürgen Kaube's question, new scientific concepts and methods to understand the social reality we are in. So is this conversation about trying to understand a new form of society, or trying to understand how a new tool has intensified the social structures, cleavages, and conflicts that we knew from before?
If I may jump in on that question, which I think is very helpful in terms of periodization and of trying to grapple with the scope of the problem and the need for very new forms of thinking as opposed to sort of updating older ones. One thing that I think is, I wrote a book called The Black Box Society and also an article co-authored called The Scored Society. So I may be a little too in on the society game. But in my defense, here would be a way of justifying, I think, this type of epochal or attempted effort to name an epoch. One is that I think that there have always been, if we look at the literature on, say, the sociology of professions, there's always been battles among professions for jurisdictional authority, for being able to say, we are the experts, say, on law. Lawyers can say, we're the experts on law, and doctors can say, we're the experts on medicine, et cetera. And I think that the classic challenge to that expertise has often been framed in a democratic light as saying, well, but the people want, say, certain things that you lawyers don't want to give them, or the doctors don't want to give them. And we see some of that in the diagonalist or Querdenken movement, I guess, in some areas in Europe now. But I think you also see, I think, with the rise of the Algorithmic Society, the rise of something I'd like to call meta-expertise, which is those who have quantitative or algorithmic expertise saying, we are above the existing professions. So rather than having sort of a challenge from below of the professions, now I think with the Algorithmic Society, you see a challenge from above saying, we actually are better at knowing what is proper practice than you are. And I think that is a real shift that deserves new forms of thought and critique. I'd also say with respect to scoring and why Daniel Citron and I wrote the article, The Scored Society, it was in part because we saw this shift in the power of people who are primarily fluent in language to those who are fluent in numbers, or at least socially accepted quantification of relative value. And just as the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank used to be half attorneys and have economists as well, now I mean it's almost all economists who are seen as having that domain expertise. And I think that is another shift that we need to watch carefully. Sometimes the forms of quantification are much more scientific, rigorous, widely applicable, and consistent, but sometimes they're not. And I think that requires new forms of thought. However, I also will concede that before our critique of scoring, there was a long literature in philosophy and policy on commensurability and critiquing commensurability and cost-benefit analysis. So I think the challenge now is to both sort of try to take on the new challenges and recognize what is definitely qualitatively new, while not neglecting the much older literatures, be they critiques of AI going back to Dreyfus and debates of Minsky in the 60s, or the critiques of quantification going back to critiques of cost-benefit analysis from much earlier. Thanks.
May I come in there? Because we've talked quite a lot about inputs and dirty data, and we've talked quite a lot about the opacity of the algorithm and the dominance of the tech guys. But we haven't quite talked as much as we might yet about the outputs and the ways in which we choose as governments, as citizens, as society, how we choose to use these tools. And it seems to me surely that is our choice. So it's not just, I mean, Rainer, you were suggesting that perhaps the Algorithmic Society is just reproducing rifts, mistrust, dissensions of the old society. Well, it's only doing that if we're letting it do that, and that is, of course, partly about the data in. It's partly about the architecture of the algorithm and the way it's constructed, but it's also a question of what we ask the algorithm to do and how we choose to interpret and imply that which it would tell us. And I remember Bernard and I had a tussle many years ago about a claim that Bernard made about the algorithm chose us, or something along those, actuarial justice chose us. I don't want to misquote quote you, Bernard. And I remember at the time, I think it was in Paris, which was lovely. I think I pushed back and said, well, why or how or should it or must it? Because we can choose to be complicit. We can choose to give the power to the tech guys. Or we can push back. I mean, whilst it's absolutely right that if you went back 20 years, the British government, the British cabinet was staffed by lawyers. Now it's staffed by tech people and businessmen who don't always necessarily know how to run a government, and one can see that in the paucity of legislation and the mess that is made by Parliament over so many things, including COVID. But we could have a more concerted and, if you like, a more kind of deliberative democratic discussion about how to use these algorithms, and not see ourselves as somehow purely as our society as the products of those algorithms. And maybe it's precisely fora like this that has the task or the duty to think about how that pushback might be formed, and how quite aside from teaching the coders to think about justice, and instead of doing as all too often happens, we feel the need when we're teaching our law students to ensure that they have the technical skills and the numerical competence to be attractive products for the city or the law firm or maybe the IT firm. Maybe we should really be thinking about how we educate those people to whom we are presently giving power, not just the coders, but all of those who stand behind and who are promoting this algorithmic society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could jump in, I think that's right. I mean, I think that this conversation, which is following on Reiner's provocation, is entirely right, which is to try and understand how power circulates differently in what we are calling this algorithmic society. And my only thought, Lucia, here is that I agree entirely with you that there are going to be opportunities through education and intervention to try to shape the relations of power in what it seems to be this algorithmic society, or however we want to call it, the digital age. But I think that we have to be attuned to the force of Apple. I mean, the force of these these GAFAs, right? And also, which was the whole point of the exploration of the Expository Society, the way our subjectivity is drawn in and shaped by these platforms, and it's a generational thing in part, I think. And actually, Reiner, one of the big questions about the way power circulates is a generational story, I believe, today. But I don't want to age myself or whatever, but I mean, but younger generations who are spending so much time on these platforms, right? We have to think about that, and we have to think about consumption and the attraction of consumption, which has always been such a big part of neoliberalism, and which is probably what brought down the Berlin Wall, right? But these forces are extraordinary, and it's not going to be that easy for us, maybe as educators, with our small domain and our and generational differences and whatnot to ethicize or transform or add those. I mean, the value inputs, Lucia, that you were talking about, it's extremely difficult because of the desire to present ourselves now on social media, and to take selfies everywhere we are, and to post those selfies on every platform, and to just right, Christoph. Yeah, I mean, there are ways in which these technologies create possibilities that then affect our psyche in ways that are different than, and that create forces that are extraordinarily difficult to simply master.
Maybe to just jump in there, I think this is crucial. It's not like, I would argue, it's not like, you know, the bad guys, Apple and Amazon and everything. We are already in the process of being reprogrammed, or our subjectivity is being transformed into a different kind of way. Also, I mean, now coming back to the topic of this panel, how the freedom to deviate is conceptualized. So you could argue that freedom to try things, to not be predictable, to, you know, maybe smoke weed or whatever, that all these freedoms, from a traditional point of view, they have also, at least also, a certain positive connotation. They promise future, they promise innovation, etc., etc. But I'm not sure whether this is still the image that we're having when thinking about freedom. Rather, it's now freedom autonomy might actually be a threat, a risk. Now we have to contain that. We have to make people predictable, so that we can contain and manage these risks. And this changes subjectivity. It also changes political systems very fundamentally. And this is, I think, where there might be a qualitative shift from the past to the future, or to an algorithmic society, although it is, as I argued in the chat, not as if this is like something coming down on us and it hits us like a comet. It's an evolution, but it has the potential, or maybe it has already developed into something qualitatively different.
Well, I'm not quite sure if the opposition of the algorithm and freedom is it's very suitable for this question, because I remember a lecture of Andrew Abbott, the sociologist from Chicago, to the freshmen of Chicago, in which he said, 2 of 3 of you will be divorced in 10 years. We know that from sociological studies. So, I mean, you could say that's a statement against freedom, the freedom not to be to go into a divorce, but that would be I think the wrong description. And in some sense, the big data world is is a very, very strong usage of this type of prediction. Yeah. You have big numbers, and you have averages, and you have this type of prediction. And I think it would be silly to say, no, I'm not going to be divorced in 10 years. So, which on the base of the individual would be correct. Of course, it was not a saying about individuals, but of huge groups, or at least the group of the freshmen of the Chicago University. But I think that would be the wrong type of resistance against this algorithmic ontology. In my mind, it would be more that one would say, where do they fulfill the expectations, and where are they wrong? In what type of social situations average calculations do matter, and in which type of social situations they don't. I would be resistant to make a dualism, freedom on the one side and algorithm on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question that Christoph is raising, though, which is the discourse of freedom, because I agree. I think, Jürgen, actually, that a lot of the discourse of algorithm is about freedom, and that a lot of the and a lot of the rhetoric that surrounds Silicon Valley is a freedom story. And I think here of Luc Boltanski and Eve Shapielo's brilliant book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, right, where it was these desires for freedom and liberation that were colonized and captured by capitalist management, right? And so that it is the space of freedom. And if you work at a place like, I don't know, if you work at some of these digital startups, I don't want to name any, some can be extraordinarily oppressive and track you and whatnot. And they probably are all doing that. But there's also the sense that, you can be in your flip-flops, drinking your Frappuccino and playing, game boards while you're thinking about your model, right? I mean, it's like it has completely changed the discipline of work and of the workplace has been completely transformed in the imagination in many of these institutions as places of utter freedom. And so it's, I think there's so many different dimensions in which the rhetoric of freedom is deployed in these debates. But I certainly think, Jürgen, you're right that we can't, just put it as, algorithms on one side and freedom on the other. But then the question becomes, what is this? What happens to the opportunity to deviate, maybe, or to conform too? Because I mean, maybe the desire to deviate is maybe a defective human desire that is shared by everyone on this screen, but maybe the more fully adaptive desire is to conform.
Yeah, or it is a mixture.
Right.
Say on a local base, you are always defect in some sense and conform in another sense. And I mean the social expectation in the modern world. I think we have 1 million norms. So you always will be a non-conformative person because you cannot conform to every norm which is addressed to you.
Can I come back in here, because I think you've raised some incredibly interesting points, and I'm having spent 30 years of my life trying to teach jurisprudence to undergraduates. Very unsuccessfully, I should say, but so much is predicated on the idea of individual autonomy and choice, that the idea that human dignity requires the capacity not only for choice but also for hope. And Jürgen's rendition of Andy Abbott's, you will be divorced, or what 1% or 10% or whatever of you will be divorced in 10 years, denies hope. But actually, and here my ability to be endlessly kind of optimistic and upbeat begins to get eroded, because if one thinks about the pandemic, one of the very terrifying aspects of that is, okay, so we appear to have freedom to work from home. We can pretend to work from our offices when we're actually at home, which is what I'm doing now. And people have applauded the degree to which that gives people greater flexibility, and to a certain extent that's true. But if one looks at the way that many of the firms, and particularly city firms, are using keyboard monitoring to determine whether people are actually at their at their desks. Call centers do this all the time. They're using online cameras to monitor whether people are actually working or not. Then some of the very fundamental things that we teach our law students, and indeed in other disciplines as well, about the importance of individual autonomy, and even the freedom to deviate or conform, seems to me in one keystroke, or the lack of a keystroke seems to be gone. That is, the failure to enter that keystroke is being monitored by those algorithms from afar. And so not only do we not have the choice or the freedom to deviate, we actually no longer perhaps even have the choice to conform, because if we fail to conform, we'll quite simply be out of a job, or at least some of us.
Yes, and I think that point about the up and downside of the workplace surveillance is so helpful, because I've recently just been following some work by Mary Towers and the European Trade Unions Commission to challenge workplace monitoring, saying that it is violative of the GDPR because of just the overwhelming degree of the ability of the employer to foist onto employees these terms. And there was actually a really creative, interesting article by some Oxford scholars, I think, saying that some forms of workplace monitoring are so intense that they could be deemed false imprisonment, which I thought was such an interesting sort of model of taking forward. I see in the comments there was a comment on the panopticon, this panoptic idea. I also think that there are some very hard decisions to be made about the future technologization, digitization of things like punishment. There are a lot of people that look at, say, the conditions in US prisons and who say, well, the clear solution here is to tell those who would be in prison that they can put an app on their phone that will report if they go 15 feet beyond their house, right? And this sort of thing, I mean, clearly from a short-term perspective of improving one's welfare, I would certainly much rather prefer to be in that sort of monitoring situation than in a prison. However, the normalization of that type of extremely intense and constant monitoring is something that I think really undermines a lot of social values, and also I think is maybe distracts us from a broader abolitionist project that certainly Bernard has contributed so much to, and that I think is very important here in terms of thinking about the future of freedom and control. And so therefore, and Ruha Benjamin in her book Race After Technology, she looks at these types of supposed humanization of punishment and says, this is just like the grilletes, this is digital chains on individuals. And I think that is quite a powerful metaphor there. And I think that this is, so I think that my bottom line here would be that we should really watch out for making small incremental improvement, what appear to be improvements to welfare by, for example, moving from an actual prison to a virtual prison, to be careful that these small movements that seem to be doing good are not contributing to a larger social process that is quite frightening.
If I may hop in here, then I think it all leads back to the question of who controls and who's in power and who uses the algorithms. And that's, again, the question of, well, how do we control those who are in control? Big old question. And I don't really see how we can achieve that unless we limit to a certain extent the use of algorithms in certain circumstances where we find them particularly counterintuitive or problematic for certain reasons. And that leads us back to Lucia's point, basically, that we have to ask the question, what type of society do we stand for and what do we consider as normative standards? And I'm sorry that I'm beating up on this point again, but actually the freedom to deviate is also the freedom to not be totally controlled. And maybe that's something that we should cherish more than we sometimes do when we're talking about the big old discussion on liberty versus security, giving it a different kind of intensity here.
Don't you think that the problem is that the people who use Google, that means we all, have not the feeling of being controlled, and even if you give them a lecture and say, yeah, in some sense you are controlled because the whole business model of Google or Amazon or whatever is based on getting data and selling data and so on, they will say, okay, but if I'm in a search of a parking lot or a pizzeria or a dentist or whatever, it is very practical for me to give the information for my own personal data to them in exchange of getting the dentist. And that's, of course, a very tiny description of the whole thing. But if you elaborate on it, you would say, okay, there's the data and the combination of data. And if you introduce monopoly, say every datum relates to every other datum in some sense, even search for dentist relates to search for pizzeria or searching for a parking lot. And you have a strange combination of capitalism and socialism, because one firm could be the effective form of dealing with all these data combination. And the interesting question for me is, if not a lot of people would say, okay, I'm fine with that. It's fine with me. Where are the strange cases of misuse of it? Or why should I be afraid? I think I don't want to say there is no such threat, but I think we should consider it that many people will say that's freedom. It's the freedom to find a parking lot in Frankfurt.
That's an interesting point of freedom, but let me just very quickly hop in with one thought here, and that is the exact problem of information as a public good in the economic sense. It simply doesn't hurt if it is used for purposes which it is not intended to be used for. And so if someone takes along my banana and eats it, then I will find that it hurts me. But if someone takes my information, recombines it with someone else's information, and then deducts certain behavior on third parties, not necessarily me myself, that doesn't hurt me at first. And I can only cite, it's not an academic, but Edward Snowden said at a certain point that if you say I have nothing to hide and that's why privacy is not a value, it's the same as if you say I have nothing to say and therefore freedom of speech is not of importance.
Yeah, that's a China solution, the Chinese solution.
So two thoughts here. I mean, to pick up on Indra, what you were saying, I mean, I think it all has to do with how sensitive and conscious we are of issues of subject creation and subjectivity. You know, it's not as if our subjectivity is not going to be fully shaped by external forces in any event. It's not as if we have total control over our subjectivity ever, and we didn't have that before the digital age. But I think it's becoming conscious and worried about the, you know, subliminal, subconscious ways in which wherever you want to go psychologically, the ways in which our subjectivity is shaped by all of the digital advertising and material that is thrown at us on the basis of our digital exhaust, essentially, right? And so I think, Jürgen, it has to be at some point we have to then become worried, not necessarily about the gross, extraordinary cases where something really bad has happened as a result of, you know, and of course those do matter. You know, insurance rates can change, insurance premiums can change because they've got information that you have a condition, or that you smoke, or that you're overweight, or, you know, I mean, you can identify all of that. But I think more important is how is it that we are allowing our desires to be shaped, really, through all the information that is thrown at us in aggregating all of our data. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then going back to Lucia's an earlier point, we have to, I mean, there are concrete cases here where we can think about the use of these algorithms in particular contexts, how much of a violation of due process they are. For instance, in New York State or other American jurisdictions, we use risk scores and future dangerous scores in sentencing where we don't even know, and this is, the black box, Frank's black box, we don't even know what the algorithm is because it's proprietary to a private firm that the legislature has then incorporated into the sentencing decision. So as a matter of due process, I mean, of elementary due process, one would think that any jurist would say, well, wait a minute, you can't sentence someone based on a tool that you don't even have access to, right? But of course we do. So we're pretty far from where we should be in terms of due process. But then the other problem in these very concrete situations, and so these are the nightmares, Jürgen, that we can be afraid of, even if I think what's even more important is just our subjectivity, but the nightmares is that many of these tools are patently discriminatory. All you have to do is just look at the factor. If you get to peek at them, or if they are public, as they are in some places, and you just see, you get 4 extra points if you didn't graduate from high school. You get 4 extra points if you don't have a regular employment. It's like, boy, those things correlate in this country, right? And it's just, I can look at those facially and say, you've got, prior arrests. Well, in a city like New York, which does prior arrests, that arrests or that stops and frisks on the basis of race, well, that factor is going to be loaded, right? So I think we have these dangers that we are aware of and very far from addressing. But then we also have these other issues of how is it that we are being transformed as consumers, as selfie takers. I know, Lucia, you haven't ever taken a selfie, but as persons who might be on social media. Okay.
So it's 1:08 in Frankfurt time.
So can I have 30 seconds?
Yes, of course.
So I mean, just in direct response to Bernhard, so why not consider that algorithmic data exactly as we consider evidence? Why not subject it to requirements of equality of arms, to interrogation, to cross-examination, to all the requirements that we would ordinarily subject evidence to in terms of probity and verification? And is that so radical? And is it beyond our capacity of lawyers to make that a requirement? At least, I mean, we can't do it for the Algorithmic Society, but maybe we could do it in the courtroom.
Well, definitely, we litigate, but we lose. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in the UK, so those are things we litigate in the United States, and there's no due process right to actually know what's in the black box. That's remarkable. It's crazy. Yeah. But I agree with the ambition.
That's a good last word. We agree with the ambition. I always think, I mean, being not a scientist, not at a university, but in a company which makes a newspaper, and I mean, 3 or 5 days being ausgesetzt, I don't know the English word for it, PowerPoint presentation and Excel calculations and all these things. And I would confirm to this saying, we agree to the ambition to fight against it and to mock about it and to say that's silly and it's no rational in it and it's not effective. So I'm quite hopeful that this is a point in history to say, okay, there's a, maybe we call it power or force or whatever. Also the power is splitted and it's capitalism, so it's also competition. It's not only cooperation. But I would say I believe in the insistence of some things to be silly and contradictive and not very convincing. So I think we don't have more weapons, but I think it's a good weapon. So perhaps we close it and now we in Germany go to the game against Hungary.
Good. Thank you.
I think every participant of the panel and every participant of the audience, and it was during the whole session I made notice, so it's a good session for me.
Let me take over. Thank you all very much. Jürgen Kaube for his moderation, for all of you for inspiring discussion points, for picking up very queer thoughts sometimes and turning it into something useful, for bridging the different cultures we're coming from, the different cultures, the different legal cultures we see. And let me also point out this was a finale grandioso for our series here, which Christoph and I had, and we'll continue this in the next semester with ConTrust, and then we'll look at algorithms and political systems. So it might be that we'll come back to some of the speakers here to join us for a single session. Thank you all very much. Christoph?
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you, but also to the people in the background who made this possible. So Anke Harms for organizing all the Zoom sessions, and the whole staff of Normative Orders and ConTrust, and at our chairs, we still have chairs who were administrating this and basically just preparing the ground for Indra and me to then get into the world and make these queer, as Indra said, statements. So thank you so much to all of you here virtually, and also the people on the ground who prepared this. Thank you so much.
And if I may add a note of thanks, Christoph, to you, to Indra, for organizing such a superb series, which with such a great final discussion. Thank you so much. This was marvelous.